I am delighted to welcome my friend Manu back to Network Capital, who's written yet another smashing book. Manu, congratulations. Tell us a bit about your new book and when did you get started on this journey?
Thank you, Utkarsh. It's good to be back after several years. If I remember
Yes.
correctly, we recorded my first episode with you after my second book came out. So that would have been
Yeah.
6 years or so ago, if not more. I think maybe even 7 years ago. I'm not entirely sure when we
That was
recorded.
among the first episodes we ever recorded on Network
Yeah,
Capital.
I remember. And
Yeah,
that was in an audio studio. I don't think there was a
that's right.
video in
No,
those.
there wasn't.
Yeah. The new book's been in the works for a while. As a master student, I'd done my dissertation on Hindu nationalism and the modern Hindu identity. So the idea was definitely playing on my mind for several years. Then around 2019, I thought I was ready to do a book that I'd done enough reading, study, research, all of that. I wrote half the book in 2020 and realized that I needed some more work to do. In the meantime, I also had to finish my PhD and a bunch of other things. So I did all that, came back to the book and finally finished it. And it was published in India in November 2024 and in the UK in January 2025. It's broadly, as the title suggests, Gods, Guns, and Missionaries, the making of the modern Hindu identity. It's about God in the sense that people are fighting, people and cultures fight over the idea of God. What is
Hmm.
monotheism? Is it one God? Are there many gods? Issues around that. The second is guns, which is a reference to colonialism, the existence of brown societies and colonized people under another race and another group and another culture. So it's really a reference to colonialism. And the missionaries is a reference to, of course, the Christian missionaries who engage in a process of dialogue with Hindu thinkers and Hindu intellectuals in India from the Portuguese period, say 1500 onwards, down till India's independence in the middle of the 20th century. And it's about how these mutual dialogues end up affecting both Christianity in India, but also Hinduism in the subcontinent. So, really, it's about religious dialogue, people learning from each other, people squabbling and quarreling with each other. There is
Hmm.
violence, there is chaos, but there's also creativity, there's also a kind of innovation. And it's about how all of this affects our present. So it's a history book, but in many ways it ties into explaining why India is where it is today, how Indian politics is where it is today. The book itself doesn't touch on contemporary stuff, but in a sense, it gives you an explanation of a kind of prehistory. It gives you a groundwork that perhaps illuminates, dynamics in India today and the way Indian politics is evolving today.
Very much so. And you stop before the book gets political, which I think is a bit of a tease. And we'll get to that. We are essentially a platform that enables young professionals to build their category of one, advance their careers. Before I get into the specifics of the book, can you just tell me, like, how did this idea come to you? What has life been for you like? What, like, morning to night? You've become a bit of a fitness icon as well. So tell me a bit about how you structure your day and what has life been like for you in the last few years?
Icon, a fitness icon is a very funny expression. That's the first
Or
time that
history uncle or fitness uncle or whatever, yeah.
yeah, well, either way, that was just funny.
Yeah.
Icon was not the word I was expecting. But no, so I mean, I'm a full-time writer now. So when we did that first episode, I was working with Shashi Tharoor at that time. I was just about to
Yeah.
start my PhD. The PhD, etc., became a bridge for me to transition into full-time writing and full-time research. I'm an independent researcher. Of course, I have a PhD, etc., but I'm not affiliated to a university. I'm not a teacher. I don't lecture. I'm invited
Hmm.
for visiting lectures, but primarily, I like to focus on my own work. I have to make it work financially, and I try to focus on my own books and writing.
Yeah.
I don't write for academic audiences, I do write for a general audience, trying essentially to bridge a good academic research with good writing so as to get more people interested in history and to take an interest in these
Hmm.
fascinating stories from the past, because the past is anything but dull.
Hmm.
It's a misconception that history is boring and there's nothing interesting happening there. In terms of how I structure things, like most people go to an office, I go to an office. I have an apartment that I use as my office. So every day, if I'm in a writing,
In in
home
your
and
part in care. Okay.
yeah, Kerala, of course, it's a bigger space, so I have a separate room there. But elsewhere,
Hmm.
in Pune, where I grew up, for example, I have a place where I go. And what I do is I go there like 8:30 in the morning, as everybody goes to work. I go there, sit down from 8:30 till about 12:30. I work in one stretch. Then in the middle of the day is when I go to the gym. It's also for two reasons. One is to stretch my legs in the middle of the day, so I'm not sitting at a desk all day. The other thing is also the gym is least crowded in that at that particular slot.
Yeah.
I go
Smart.
for a 1 to 2 slot at the gym, come back, have lunch, do all of that, shower again, finish all of that, and then again work for another installment from say 3 o'clock till 7:30. And 7:30 I switch off. Then it's just a Netflix and entertainment, and I read a bit before going to bed. And that's usually reading for fun, not reading for work.
Hmm.
Something that I want to read as opposed to I need to read. So there is a very boring routine that is there, and I keep saying this,
Hmm.
that routines are underrated. Boring things are underrated. Sometimes I think you're most efficient and productive when you have a boring routine, because it squeezes out the best in you by just sticking to that routine repeatedly. But that's when I'm doing my writing phase. So this last year and a half has been a bit like that. During research, of course, I've got to travel a lot. There are archives in different countries in
Yeah.
different parts of India. You need to go stay there. You need to be in the library. But there again, it's fixed hours, right? You go at a certain time, you work all day, come back, do your thing, that kind of
Hmm.
thing. So I've structured my life that way. This whole notion that you can work from home doesn't work for me. I do need a separate space that I go to so that I can prepare myself mentally to work. I also don't think writing and all of these things just flow into you like any other job. It requires commitment. It requires a steady, a steady, repetitive kind of pattern building, and you get better and better as you keep sticking
Hmm.
to the pattern. And that's how I managed to now. This is my fifth book. It's been 10 years of publishing now. The first one was 2015 November. This came out 2024 November, so the 9-year mark. And this is now my 10th year in publishing and writing. So yeah, it's gone well so far. I've made it work so far. But let's
Yeah.
not let I mean, I don't want to deceive anyone. It requires the same amount of work and commitment you'd have to put into any entrepreneurial venture. It's not something that is easier or tougher. Like I think it's just the same. Like any job you want to do well, you have to commit at a level,
Right.
and you have to really stick to it, even when it
Yeah.
looks unpromising or even when it looks unrewarding. Only by sort of sticking to it do you ultimately gain something, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, your last few years have been really productive with the number of books, the discipline. I know you've had a few setbacks. Unfortunately, your father passed away in the middle of all of that, but you've really managed to be stoic and do the best you can. So, first of all, congratulations for that.
Thank
And
you.
your routine does sound incredible. You managed to get 7 hours of deep work every day. That's phenomenal. Like a lot of people spend that time in office, but the deep work amount is a lot lower than that. So
Yeah,
these,
I should confess there are bad days as well. But
hmm,
my trick to handling that is, say if there's a bad day and I'm not able to get things out on paper the way I want to get them out, I'll still work, but I'll do a different kind of work. So for instance, I may do some more research, I may do some more reading, I'll make notes, or I'll write a newspaper column, or I'll write an article. If
hmm,
I don't want to do anything historical related to the book, then I'll do something, a culture piece for a newspaper, or a travel piece for somebody. So I'll find
hmm,
a way to still make those hours count, but it may not be that I'm really switched on as far as the book or my main project is concerned. I have to find something else that's in the broad domain of what I do, but at the same time is enough of a change for me to be able to break out of that, that sort of writer's block or whatever you want to call it. So there are
right.
ups and downs, like in everybody's professional situations, but there are ways to manage it, and I think each of us finds tricks to manage it. I rarely sort of lounge about and like waste my time. That doesn't happen very.
Hmm. Was your PhD funded?
It was partially funded, but not entirely. It's the
So
U.
you,
It was a UK PhD. As you know, the UK system is
yeah,
a very tough one, and there's lots of problems in the UK system. Unlike in America, where if you get into a good university, you're guaranteed not only funding but also stipend and all of that. In
right.
UK, it's a bit more challenging. And for people like me who've already studied in the UK, I'd also done my masters here. In a way, it also it removes us from a lot of these scholarship applications, because they say you've already studied here once. The priorities for people who are coming into the UK for the first time.
For the first time,
There's some
yeah.
issues like that. Yeah.
Mhm. So you managed to make it work. So you finish your PhD, you're on this path. The number of people who are able to make it as a full-time writer anywhere in the world is quite limited. You have to, of course, make it work financially. You need to have the discipline. You need to have the rigor to go through it every day. How did you decide to be on this journey?
It interested me. It was something I was interested in personally at a very passionate, personal, deep level. Of course, one is also aware that when you venture into something, your mother's also a writer, right? You know that there are uncertainties. There's no monthly paycheck that comes in. So even
Yeah.
if you are making money, it's coming in very unpredictable tranches. So you may have a very productive, pay month, say at one point of time, and then for 3 months you see no money, and then you have to, and the fourth month you'll again make a chunk of money, something like that.
Mm,
So it's a bit unpredictable in that sense. So I'm not someone who can take on debt, for example, because even
mm,
if I can technically service loans or whatever, it's just too much pressure when you know there isn't a monthly paycheck. At the end of
mhm,
the year, when I look back at my accounts, I was like, yeah, I could easily have paid off a mortgage or done things. But in
mm.
the moment, it's just unnecessary stress. So you have to be prepared to live with some uncertainties of
Yeah.
that kind. But again, it's a choice you make. Ultimately, in life, we make choices and we have to live with the choices. You make your bed, you have to lie in it. That's the
Right.
principle. It's the old-fashioned realistic principle that I work with. I'm not very sentimental about life. So I knew when I got into this that it would mean a certain kind of hard work. It would mean certain specific life choices. And I was prepared to make that because for me,
Mm,
passion mattered enough that I was prepared to make those, not sacrifices, but make certain choices and amendments and modifications in the way I lived and so on. So that's, I think, first is just the psychological accepting of the fact that if
mm,
this is the path I want, there are going to be ups and downs. It's not going to be like other people's paths. The other thing is, of course, being slightly more strategic in the way you do things, because I've realized, for instance, that there are a lot of good writers, but they're not always necessarily good at getting their book noticed or putting their voice out there. Whereas in the age of social media, podcasts, online stuff, YouTube, etc., it's not just the writer who matters. Often the sad truth is that the it's not the book that matters, the writer also matters. Like your voice also
yeah.
has to stand out in some way. But there again, I was lucky in the sense that from the time I was much younger in school and college, etc., I've been comfortable on stage. I've been comfortable in front of
Mm,
the mic. So those traits have also served me well. So it's not just the hard work. You also have a bit of luck in terms of personality traits, being able to do things a certain way, which other people may not be. So I shouldn't generalize and say that everyone should follow a certain formula and it will work. For some people, it will. For some people, it won't. So there's also that, and of course, I think I do believe luck plays a role at the end of the day. My ex-boss Karan Moria used to say, "Success is when hard work meets good luck," which is that you'll work hard for 5 years, you may not have that moment of luck, but then in the sixth year, that luck may suddenly show up, and that's when you have what you call success. So at some level, I sort of believe in that as well.
we had both Karan and Dr. Tharoor, as you
On
know,
the
on the
show,
podcast. Yeah.
both
And
encouraging. Yeah.
both have done really well, built their category of one. In my second book, which is titled The Passion Economy and the Side Hustle Revolution, I essentially make this argument that what we call passion essentially comes down to suffering. That's the origin of the word, and people should be willing to suffer if they want to go down that path. So yeah, this is super helpful.
I mean,
But
you probably get cancelled for saying that in certain circles, but I see what you mean because the thing is, there
yes, I mean
is a
we
cost.
can get canceled for a lot of things. You've had that
I've been
tete-a-tete
cancelled
with
many times.
cancellation as
Oh
well.
yes, no, but the thing is, I see your point because the frank truth is there is a cost. Now, whether you call it suffering or not, when you make that's what I was also alluding to earlier, which is that when you make certain choices, it comes at a certain cost, and whether or
Yeah.
not you're prepared to pay that price is the question. People who are not perfectly fine, I don't think it's everybody's cup of tea, but some of us are prepared to pay that price because
Yeah.
again what you want to do in life and what you want to achieve in life is might be slightly different. So then you're prepared to pay certain prices and costs in this moment because you've
Mm,
got a longer arc or a longer plan in mind. So in that sense, yeah, I totally understand what you're saying, and I think I've my very first book, I started working at the age of 19 on that book. It was
mm,
published at 25. 6 years of really grueling work while I had to also build a career, also be in office, also earn money, all of those things. Those 6 years, in some ways, now that I look back, I think they were great for character building. At the time, it felt like it was dreadful hard work. Work in the
mm,
office till the evening, then stay up till 2 or 3 at night writing, and somehow between all of this, you can find time to research, to travel to places. All my savings were going in sourcing documents and things like that. So the age of 25, it was like when the book was coming out, it was almost like, will this even pan out? Did I just spend 6 years working very hard for nothing? For me, it
mm.
panned out. Luckily, it worked out. And since then, I've been able to build on that. But it was 6 years of suffering. It was 6 years of struggle.
Yeah.
But would I trade it for anything else? Knowing me, no. I'm perfectly happy to have struggled and suffered that much. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the Latin word for passion
Yeah.
is suffering. So, I mean, hopefully they don't cancel me or you for it. But yes, I very, very much come from the school of thought. So, tell me about this book. What did you set out to accomplish with this? Because it goes through 500 years and stops where it should, perhaps because you didn't want to get political, you didn't want to comment on what's going on um, in India at the moment. But what was your goal?
No, the book is political in the sense that it's dealing with a political history. So in that sense, it's not political.
Which is,
Just I
some
didn't
of
want
our
to
listeners are not Indian. Would be really
get,
good for them to know.
I didn't want to get into the contemporary politics because even
Hmm,
structurally, the
hmm,
moment you bring contemporary politics on which people's opinions are very polarizing and divided into a book, there's a risk that it'll overwhelm the rest of the book. It's just the ending. I could have brought it in the epilogue of the book, and I that was my original intention. But having written most of the book, I thought it didn't make sense because then people would focus only on that because that is what most people are thinking about, and then view the rest of the book through the prism of what my opinions or what my
hmm,
views and conclusions are in that segment. So I thought,
hmm,
actually, no, this is a history book. I'm going to draw a hard deadline around India's independence in 1947. After that is what we call contemporary history. Before that is the period that I work on. So I'm just going to stay in my lane, focus on that. My
hmm.
opinions on the present are available elsewhere. I just didn't want it in this particular book because the
Right.
book is also a study on religion. It is also a study on identity. It's already controversial themes and topics. So you want people to think, you want people to understand and learn. You don't want to unnecessarily get into contemporary political debates. But
Hmm,
on the question of what the book is about, the book is about religious conflict, but it's also about religious dialogue. It's also about how religions feed off each other and transform each other. I mean, around the world, if you look at Christianity takes shape partly by looking at Judaism. Judaism looks at itself as an ism partly against Christianity. So you need each other to define each other in a sense. And this book is really about how Hinduism begins to fashion itself as an ism, as a modern world religion, partly
hmm,
because of the conflict and the interaction with Christianity and Christian missionaries in the colonial period. Mostly, when we think of the modern Hindu identity and Hindutva and so on in India, it's done through the Hindu-Muslim prism, which is important. But I thought there was a bit of a lacuna, a bit of a gap in understanding there, because a lot of the influence did come from Christianity and colonialism. Christian missionaries never converted large numbers of people, but their psychological and structural impact was in many ways very significant, and I wanted to investigate that. But at the same time, the book also has some very charismatic figures. It's woven through a bunch. There's a bunch of life stories that also come into the book. Princes who are te- technically traditionally Hindu, but also very modern in their outlook in the early 19th century. So on the one hand, patronizing Hindu temples, presenting cows to Brahmins and things like that. On the other hand, the same prince was also dissecting a dead body, studying modern science, translating
hmm,
modern science into Indian languages, and getting kids to study Western science in an Indian idiom, things like that. There's these great debates Hindus and Christian missionaries are having, some of which are very comical, some of which get really violent and aggressive. And it's a whole spectrum. You realize that on both sides, human beings are not just stereotypes. There are different types in either camp. And it gives you a sense of complexity, which I think is also useful for the present, because when we put people into silos and camps, we sometimes forget that these are people at the end of the day. And even when you have ideological groupings, there's a whole spectrum within that as well. It's not as if it's a
hmm,
monolith on either side. So it's a bit about that as well. And of course, it's about colonialism. I'd like to think it's a more nuanced take on colonialism because it highlights a time when, we have a very black and white view of how colonialism operated now. Yes, it was an oppressive system in general, but it had chapters to it, and the evolution of colonialism itself is quite interesting because at one point you have white men, these British officials, patronizing Hindu temples, leading Hindu gods in processions, smashing
hmm,
coconuts in temples, donating to temples, all of that, because they were keen in that phase to accommodate and be respectful of local culture. And the local societies of the time responded as well and saw them very much as white rajas of a certain kind. But then at a
hmm,
certain point, prejudice, racism, all of this comes in, and this compact that was very sort of delicately held together starts to fall apart. And that's where hostility and that aggressive anti nationalism of that period emerges as well. So it's also a study in how, as human beings, we fall into the same patterns again and again. We're seeing it in our world as well. There's a way of building the world which has that compact, which has diplomacy, which has people working together. But there's also a my way or the highway attitude in which you end up ripping things apart. It's happening as we speak,
yeah,
around the world as we're
hmm,
recording this. So in that sense, you also realize some of these things are just patterns that keep reappearing. In this case, I look at the 19th and 18th centuries and the Portuguese period onwards. And of course, in our time, we're also seeing it separately, you know, happening as well.
The notion that Western missionaries are coming with a particular agenda and trying to change the alchemy of India has been in and around discussions for a while. But you suggest a more nuanced take on that. Was that your hypothesis when you started with, or did history reveal itself this way?
No, as you do your research, things become clearer and clearer. And again, the book, I think for me at least, a good history book doesn't necessarily always give you categorical conclusions. It explains a lot, but it often also leaves you with some provocative questions. And
Hmm.
for me, it was really the questions that were more interesting, which is that yes, Christian missionaries came in. Yes, there were unpleasant aspects to it. Yes, there was hostility in return. And some of the consequences we're still living with, they're still alive in our country, in India. But at the same time, as I said, it was also a time of creativity. There was also engagement. People were learning from each other. Who would have thought that Voltaire sitting in Europe during the Enlightenment, attacking the Catholic Church, would cite the Vedas and use the Vedas from Hinduism as a means to do that? Who would have
Hmm.
thought that Hindu reformers in the 19th century would look at the Protestant Reformation in Europe and use that as a model for Hindu Reformation in the 19th century in India? These are just happening in different parts of the world, and yet it makes sense. We think again that religious identities operate in silos, but no, just as Hinduism adapted certain qualities from Christianity and claimed it for itself and remade itself, Christianity in India was also transformed. In South Indian Christianity, in Tamil Nadu, etc., Catholics accepted castes. They started dressing like local Brahmins. They became vegetarians. In certain shrines, goat sacrifices were offered to Catholic saints, just as they were offered to local goddesses like Kali. Christianity got Hinduized in this part of India. So
Hmm.
book in many ways raises challenges to simplistic ways of thinking around religion and identity, and ultimately tells you that life is constantly in flux. These things are constantly changing and evolving. And that really is the point of the book, that do not look for simplistic answers that confirm one ideological position or the other, because
Hmm.
ideologies depend on selective readings of history. But if you look at history itself, you will find that actually no, it was far more complex, and you cannot reach simplistic conclusions of any kind.
Yeah. And your home state of Kerala has been instrumental. It's been the hotbed of a lot of these discussions and interactions that took place. So talk to us about that and also give us a flavor of the fact that you read part of your high school studies in a state curriculum. How did that influence your research for the book?
Very much. I mean, I think it was very useful to be able to. There's a kind of Indian intellectual, I suppose, who operates only in the English language. And I think now that I look back, the fact that I can speak three different Indian languages in addition to English, so I can do Hindi, I can do Marathi, I can do Malayalam, it really does help, because in these places you can actually talk to people directly and you pick up things in a way that you wouldn't necessarily get in an English system. In
Hmm.
the same way, I think that state curriculum, and I had to move to that particular school because of health reasons as a kid. It was the closest one available, as opposed to the much fancier ICSE school that I was originally enrolled in. But I was a very unhealthy child, so I had to be moved closer home.
Hmm.
And this was the school I ended up going to. But there's a much wider spectrum of people in that school. If I'd gone to the ICSE school, I think I would have been around a certain class of Indians, a certain class of people, a certain type of Indian of that time.
Hmm.
Whereas in the other school, there was economically people of various backgrounds, socially people of various backgrounds. That also, I think, when you're exposed to that from an early age, it does give you insights into, I don't know, I don't want to blow my own trumpet, but I think it definitely helped me look at the world a certain way and be open to and receptive to ideas and different kinds of people, and not necessarily write things off because they come from an unfashionable viewpoint or they come from an unfashionable segment
Hmm.
of society. So there's some advantages of that nature. On my home state, yes. I mean, I grew up. I'm from Kerala, but I grew up outside Kerala in Maharashtra. But every year I'd
Hmm.
spend at least 2.5 months in Kerala. Any vacation I got, I would come. Uh, and this religious dialogue that the book covers, it's very, very visible in Kerala. Kerala's had, of course, Hindus for the longest time. It's had Christianity for the longest time. When the Portuguese first came and met local Kerala Christians and said, okay, all your churches belong to the Pope, the local Christians said, yes, we're Christians, but who's the Pope? Because they were not Catholic. They belonged to the Persian church, and they didn't have much interaction with the Roman Catholics of Europe. And the Portuguese were very stunned by this. They thought that these people practiced a very corrupted Christianity simply because
mm,
their Christianity was very rooted in local culture. It had very local resonances, a lot very local flavors. It had a lot of overlaps with local Hindu practice. Hindus required Syrian Christians and treated Syrian Christians as upper caste Christians. The Christians were also participants in Hindu festivals, etc. The Portuguese couldn't get their head around any of this. But to the people living in Kerala, it was perfectly natural. And growing up, I've seen this in my own house. We are Hindus, but there was also an image of Jesus Christ because he was just seen as a holy man to admire, and there was no
mm,
hesitation in several family members of mine, several homes of my cousins, etc., for a picture of Jesus to also be kept in the puja area of the house, simply because they saw him not necessarily as the face of a foreign religion. They saw him as a holy, wise man who taught humanity something and whose teachings did have overlaps with Hinduism, and therefore
mm,
belonged in a sense in the puja room. Similarly with Islam, I'm not saying there weren't religious tensions. Of course, there were religious tensions, but equally there were also bridges that people were able to build with each other. In North Kerala, I forget the name of the temple. There's a temple where if you go inside, you'll see these bronze figurines of a man without arms. It
mm,
represents, some say Tipu Sultan's invasion, but some say invasion in general, not sure which period. But there was an army from outside that came in, and this Muslim man helped defend this Hindu temple from an invading army of a Muslim sultan. And therefore, once the temple was defended, the war, etc., ended, this Muslim man, has been commemorated and given a place inside the temple. So I grew up in a state that had all of these stories around me, which is also why
mm,
I thought simplistic ideas of religion do not work, because our lived experience in India is much more complex. And it's not just a case of the past, it's also happening in the present in some very curious ways. One story I keep telling is about this deity in Alleppey, again very close to my district where my ancestral home
mm,
is. He's Murugan, which is again a South Indian god. And it's interesting that the story goes that there was an unwell child who wasn't getting better, and his parents asked him to go and make an offering to Murugan. And in addition to
mm.
the usual offerings, he had a munch chocolate in his hand, and he put the chocolate in front of the god. And they say the next morning he recovered. Since then, people refer to this Murugan as Munch Murugan, and everybody now makes offerings of munch chocolate there. So if you Google Munch Murugan, you'll see the image of this temple god with garlands made of munch. People do this ceremony called Tulabharam, where they weigh themselves, usually in grain and coconut, and donate it to the temple. But people do that with the munch chocolate. It's not just any chocolate; it has to be munch chocolate in that munch wrapper that people donate to
That,
the
yeah,
temple.
that violet wrapper that,
Exactly.
some of our listeners who live in the UK may not, or US may not know what you're talking about. But it's a chocolate that you get in India, maybe elsewhere. But the fact that Munch Murugan exists should tell you a bit about how delicious Manu's book really is. So, give me, what was your biggest surprise and inference of finding Munch Murugan, the fact that he exists and people have sort of tweaked their customs in accordance with a story that happens? What does it tell you about the way narratives are reconstructed? Um,
In sociology, etc., there's this notion of imagined communities. The thing is, all communities are imagined in the sense that we are the ones who give logic to why such and such a thing is a community. And then communities form their own narratives. So communities have the option sometimes, and some communities frame themselves with very open ended, vibrant sort of narratives. Sometimes it's closed narratives, it's reactionary, defensive narratives. And they can also happen due to historical reasons. If you're a secure, confident culture, then it's easier for you to be open. But if you're a culture that's been vanquished, in India's case, you've been under colonialism, etc., it is only natural you're going to be defensive, you're going to be suspicious of the foreign, you're going to be slightly more circumspect about what you draw in and what you leave out. So there are historical dynamics to this. But to me, it's always fascinating that ultimately it is us as human beings, each generation defining and redefining what we are, what community means to us, how we interpret the past, and how we use that past to make sense of the present. And how we do these things also determines what shape the future takes. So
mm,
ultimately, these things aren't just happening in some land far, far away. They're also choices we make in the present. And how we look at the past, how we shape our present now, that determines a lot of things for the future as well. So for me, that's always been a fascinating aspect of studying history, which is that these connections, at the time when people were making these connections, they did not take it for granted that society would evolve a certain way. We now, in retrospect, try to find roots for the way the world is in history. But at the time, there were several pieces up in the air. How they would land was anybody's guess. But they landed
right.
in strange ways. We then find new meaning for them. We invent a certain kind of narrative around it and then move forward. So
Hmm.
it's all like very diverse and interesting and intricate in some ways, very interwoven. But again, the ultimate lesson is that it's not simplistic. I don't think, any quest in as far as human beings go and human society goes can settle for simplistic answers.
Yeah, and that's been one major contribution of all your works and the examples you provide. I think at some point you were talking about this God uh, who needs to be given a dash of alcohol as an offering,
Yeah, yeah,
which
there
was
are
quite
certain
surprising to me.
Yeah,
Or
there are many
in
gods of this nature who we assume that all gods are vegetarian gods in India because vegetarianism is associated with ritual purity. But in reality,
Right.
there are gods who are non-vegetarian gods.
Hmm.
And these can sometimes transform themselves. For example, you'll find
Hmm.
lots of temples where offerings are made to the gods of watermelons and other kinds of melons, etc., which is
Yeah.
usually a sign that at some cucumbers, which is usually a sign that at some point there was animal sacrifice there. This animal sacrifice was replaced with a proxy, and the proxy is the melon or the cucumber or whatever.
Hmm.
There are
Yeah.
in Kerala and North Kerala, there's a place called Madekava, and the goddess from there was taken consecrated in a form in South Kerala as well. If I'm
Hmm.
not mistaken, in the South Kerala format, she's now a vegetarian god. But in her original temple in Madekava, her prasadam is still chicken cooked with moong or something like that. Paira, I think it's
Hmm.
called in Malayalam. It's a non-vegetarian prasadam that you get there. So there are still lots of non-vegetarian gods in Hinduism. There's still gods who require alcohol in such offerings, and it's not some one size fits all
Hmm.
kind of religious formula. Hinduism is a religion that was born out of a book. It is not a religion with a scripture at its core. It's a religion, it's a conglomerate of different sects and groups that have come together and been wedded together through shared narratives and a shared framework. Precisely because of that, in their granular settings, you find a diversity of practices. Everything from animal sacrifice and alcohol to milk and honey and so-called pure offerings in some of the other temples. We also assume that all Hindu priests were Brahmins. That's not true. There were non-Brahmin
Yeah.
priests as well. Uh, you know, most people aren't aware of it, but there were plenty of non-Brahmin priests in many Hindu temples as well.
Isn't that true for your hometown as well, where a bunch of Nayars have now gone and settled abroad, and now people from what some people called the lower castes have taken on certain customs. So it's you seem to project a much more rosy, some would say, others would say holistic picture of the syncretic nature, syncretic identity of India. What's the kind of pushback you've gotten so far on this take, or what do you think could be a critique to this?
Well, no, in this book specifically, I've acknowledged that it isn't purely syncretic. There is a lot that is syncretic. You find that even in cases of violence, after a generation or two, people get along again and they paper over the violence that was there. In Goa, for example, there was a Christian missionary called Francis Xavier, Saint Francis Xavier. If you look at his actual writings from the time, he's very racist and not very pleasant towards local cultures and called them
Hmm.
barbarians and pagans and things like that. But today, Goans go to Francis Xavier Shrine. Hindu Goans go to Francis Xavier Shrine and pray and treat him very much as a local god and a local
Hmm.
divinity. So both can exist simultaneously. There is the syncretic, but yes, history is also replete with evidence of violence and people not getting along. The point is that a good historian will not focus unduly on one over the other.
Right.
Ideologically, sometimes some people will say there was only violence in the past. Other people will say it was only syncretic in the past. The reality is more complicated, which is that both existed, and we should be able to zoom out and place enough distance from our emotions and feelings, etc., and be able to look at the past with a fair amount of dispassionately, as dispassionately as possible. That's what helps you understand the past, as you said, in a holistic way. So while there
Right.
is syncretic, it is not purely a syncretic kind of exchange. There are complicated moments in history,
Hmm.
and we should have the maturity to be able to accept the entire package as opposed to being selective in the way we handle it. As far as pushback goes with this book, initially I thought I'd be cancelled by left and right both, because I've been
Why?
this in my talks as well. When I was doing my edits, I did the first intro, I edited the introduction, and I thought definitely getting cancelled by the right. Then I edited the first chapter, which talks about Christian violence against Hindus, and I thought, good lord, the left is going to cancel me. Someone's going to call me anti-Christian or something like that. Then I came back to another chapter again. I thought, okay, the right will cancel me for this. But in reality, what seems to have happened is that both sides are actually reading the book, because I think
Hmm.
both sides are finding enough in it that interests them. They may not necessarily like everything they read, but I think because I've tried to be even handed to the best of my abilities and not let, firstly, the present and present day politics come into it. I've not hesitated to call a spade a spade. If there was religious violence, there was. If it was syncretic, it was. Both can be, as I said, equally true. So when you're honest that way, I think people recognize that, and for that reason, a wider segment of people on both sides have been engaging with the book. So I was pleasantly surprised. At least there's been no cancellation so far. Hopefully, there won't be any in future as well.
Pretty sure they won't be, but yes, it's an important one. You have a lot of young readers who've suddenly become interested in history. What part of Guns, Gods, or Missionaries you think appeals most to them and why? Or is it the trifecta?
I think there's a curiosity in general about history. Look, we're living in a post-globalization kind of world, right?
Yeah.
Everything we took for
It's
granted.
very hard to define what world we're living in now,
That's
but
true.
yes, let's
But look,
call
when
it
you and I were
post-globalization.
growing up
Yeah,
in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was still this romance around globalization. It was almost as if this is the order of the world now and we can take it for granted. And a lot of
right.
that is falling apart. Nationalism is growing in people in many countries. Nativism is growing in many countries. A lot of younger people really are asking questions about where are we from, what does our identity represent, what does our culture represent, etc. So there is a genuine and I think a healthy curiosity about history, which is why I've noticed that a lot of young people are in fact reading. There is this constant lament that, oh, young people aren't reading anymore, etc.
Hmm,
The literature festivals I've spoken at in India sort of belie this claim, because I've seen heaps and heaps and heaps of young people there. At the Bangalore Literature Festival last December, I remember my session was for 45 minutes, but I was signing books for 90 minutes afterwards. A long
hmm,
queue, and the majority of the people who had gathered for these signatures with my book were young people. It wasn't
hmm,
older people. There were enough older people, but predominantly it was young people. And I make it a point to ask people what they do. And it's interesting, it's not as if they all come from the humanities. There are people who are starting to be nurses, there are engineers, there are doctors. The other day at an event in London, there was an astrophysicist. There were architects. There were people who come from a whole spectrum of society, which clearly shows that people are interested. You just need to
hmm.
make an effort to reach out to them. And I think when somebody also, and of course, you have to make it attractive to them also. If I wrote a very dull history textbook, it's very likely they wouldn't be picking it up. But it's because I
Hmm,
also make the effort to invest in storytelling and to make it accessible, to make it simple without making it simplistic. That I
hmm.
think is something of a winning formula, perhaps, in wooing readers and keeping the loyalty of your readers for your subsequent works.
It's almost like a community is developing because the quality of writing that many people are accustomed to in school is different from what historians like you are doing and doing it rather well. And the book does touch upon some very, very important themes. We haven't talked much about caste in today's podcast. Do you want to talk a bit about how that get introduced in your work in this one particular?
The book is primarily about religious identity, but with modern Hinduism, yes, caste is the biggest fragility that it still faces.
Hmm,
Even as in the British era, you have a fusing of religious identity and nationalism, and hence Hindu
hmm,
nationalism, which is now so dominant in India. To this day, including in the last elections, etc., caste remains a fragility,
hmm,
because while you're building that sort of majoritarian, homogenized identity for all Hindus, the frank truth is Hindu society is split. It is split along lines of sect, region, linguistic elements also play a role, and caste plays a role.
hmm,
What also makes caste complicated is the inequity. It is an unequal system. Some people are higher, some
hmm,
people are lower. It's not just economic inequality, it's also ritual inequality. So you
hmm,
may be a very rich, lower caste person, as it were, in quotes, but you will still be ritually poor. You will still be ritually defiled. It doesn't matter how rich you become, ritually, you're always going to be treated as nothing. Whereas a very, very poor Brahmin will still have ritual status above you. It's not just economics that matters. So caste does come into the book, including some very vociferous anti-caste activists like Jyotiba Phule, who wrote some
Yeah.
very, very direct, blunt polemics that were anti-caste and so on. So the book does cover all of that. And also, therefore, again, as I said, I like to leave questions. So even though I'm explaining one way in which we understand the modern Hindu identity, by using caste and these anti-caste polemics, I'm also posing the question as to, or rather, reminding readers that it's not some set matter. It's not something that is there and it's perfect and this is a historical consequence. There are still challenges to this identity. It's not completely set in stone, and questions can still be posed of it. And there are internal contradictions to the modern Hindu identity as well, caste being the biggest of such contradictions.
Can you talk about some figures that people would have read about in history books like Savarkar, Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Pule, etc.? And how did their identities go over an evolution? What was their role in one shaping the book and then shaping the way we understand history?
Let's take Ramohan Roy, for example, right?
Mm,
This was a very much younger man. He writes a Persian text in which you realize that he's actually not for religion as a concept at all, because he makes the argument that there is only one God. God
mm,
cannot have made contradictory rules for mankind. God is,
right.
impartial. So God's rules will be the same for everybody. But then
Mm,
religions give you contradictory precepts. So Islam says
mm,
you can't bow in front of idols. Hinduism says idols are fine. These are contradictory precepts, which to
right.
Raja Ramohan Roy logically means that these could not have come from God. These clearly
Mm,
came from human beings.
like created here.
Yeah, exactly. So he sees that religion itself is therefore a creation of man rather than a creation
Mm,
of God. But within a few years, this man realizes that, hold on. And he actually says as much. He says that the current political condition of the Hindus is not calculated for their political well being. And
mm,
therefore, he's going to invest in a reformation of Hinduism in the early 19th century. So he's very aware that what he's doing, what he's setting off is a political project that is not purely about
mm,
faith or religion or anything. It's political because India is under colonialism. There is the Christian missionary, there is the threat of conversion, and Hindus need to revitalize their religious identity, but also work together as a bloc to rise up in future and become a people, to become a modern nation, to become modernized. So what he does is he, in a sense, Protestantizes Hinduism. So just
mm,
Protestants say that there was first the Bible, the Catholic Church corrupted the Bible, corrupted Christianity, and the Protestant Reformation restored original pristine Christianity. That's the Protestant narrative. Ram Mohan Roy borrows that and applies it to Hinduism. He says, yes, first there were the Upanishads, which had all the pristine, philosophical, very high and lofty ideas of Hinduism. It got corrupted into a system of temple worship and superstition and image worship and so on. And his duty, like a Protestant reformer or a Protestant Martin Luther, was to reform Hinduism and bring it back to its original scripture, get rid of the temple worship, get rid of the superstition, and go back to the realm of
mm,
ideas, etc. And that fathers this obsession, which includes the West as well, of Advaita, Vedanta, and so on. It comes
mm,
from that tradition. It creates an intellectualized face for Hinduism in order that Hinduism should be able to stand up and hold its own against rival faiths like Islam or Christianity, etc. So you're seeing that these charismatic human beings and individuals at specific moments in history play very important roles in setting off these new dynamics there. Later, it evolves in a different way. Fresh figures come in like Swami Vivekananda,
mm,
etc., and that takes it forward. On caste, Phule was a big critic of caste, as we were discussing, and that tradition is taken forward by, say, B.R. Ambedkar, who wrote the Constitution of India, was a great anti-caste thinker and anti-caste reformer
mm,
and activist, and so on. And that tradition continues even now. And there is a third tradition of muscular nationalism about organizing people, people thinking and acting as Hindus, using the cow as a motive to
mm,
bring together different castes, etc., getting them to think of themselves in very nationalistic terms as one block of people, usually pivoted against other religions such as Islam and Christianity, etc. That is also a tradition that was created in this period and continues into our present time. And because history and the historical archive, as I said, is so complicated, you can find genealogies for all of these. You can find historical
mm.
justification for all of these. That's why I said that ultimately history is not what just happened in the past, but it's also about each generation understanding the past in new ways. And sometimes each generation emotionally drawing from the past things they need in the present for themselves rather than understanding the past on its own terms.
Do you want to tell our listeners a bit about Tilak, the dynamics between Tilak Savarkar and the contrast? Because most people outside India think of India and think of Gandhi, but there are other people who also had a role in it. And maybe introduce the difference between Hindutva, Hinduism. How did these concepts emerge? Why is it relevant to your book and the formation of Hindu identity?
Tilak was a big Congress leader, big anti-colonial leader of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Passes away around 1920. Begins his political career, say around 1880. So it's 40 years of work that we have. And 40 years. He was also a
A
journalist.
lot
So
of written work,
years of
yes.
written material as well from Tilak in the Marathi language primarily. He also served several stints in jail, first for defamation, then at one point for sedition, and then again for sedition. So the longest term was almost, I think, 5 6 years was the sentence, but he served a little bit less. He was let off slightly earlier, I think. Oh, that was the first case. Sorry, that was 18 months in the first case, and that was reduced to 12 months. But point is, he served several stints in jail as well, and he was a firebrand. This was a man who wasn't content appealing to the British through petitions and hoping that the British would reform their ways. He was very much about mass mobilization.
Mm.
His belief was that people, the masses, need to be included and involved. For this, what he thought was that instead of giving them the jargon of Western democracy, etc., which was alien to them culturally, he thought we should turn our religious festivals and existing religious platforms into political pulpits and platforms. So, for instance, festivals. He said, why should we not convert our festivals into mass gatherings that are also political in nature? He even invents new festivals. So, if you go to Western India now, there's the big annual Ganpati festival for this deity called Ganpati, right? It was largely invented in his time. He's the one who turns it into a big public
Mm.
demonstration. And originally, the British weren't fools either. They knew that on the face of it, it's a demonstration for a Hindu god. But in reality, it's bringing people out together, and it's also flexing muscle to show that we are united, we are a people, and we can march together in the name of this god with certain political goals. There
Mm.
is also somebody who tries to define Hindutva or Hindu-ness. You have Hinduism in terms of the religion, but there's also Hindu nationalism. And for Hindu nationalism, that Hindu-ness becomes very important. When you say Hindu nationalism, you're saying the nation is Hindu, which begs the question, what defines this Hindu nation and who qualifies to be a member of this Hindu nation? Tilak tries to define it religiously. He says you need to believe in the sacred cow, you need to believe in the Vedas, the main texts of Hinduism, you need to believe in multiple paths to God because Hinduism itself has multiple paths within it. That's what qualifies you to be a Hindu. But the problem with this was that Hinduism is such a diverse tradition that if you say you have to worship the cow, there are also Hindus who eat beef. You say you celebrate the Vedas, there are also Hindu traditions that are anti Vedic and do not
Mm.
uphold the Vedas. So it was leaving these important elements out, making it an imperfect definition. Savarkar was Tilak's protege of one type who essentially triumphs and sort of moves past this limitation by defining Hindutva along two very simple parameters. He says to be a Hindu or to be counted as a member of the Hindu nation, you need to only fulfill two conditions. One, that your fatherland should be in India and your holy land should be in India. Fatherland
Mm.
doesn't, you should be descended from people in India, and all your sacred spaces should be in India. So whether it's Sikhism, Jainism, Buddhism, and Hinduism, they fulfill these parameters. They are descendants of Indians, but their holy spaces are also in India. What it leaves out is the Muslim and the Christian as the primary outsiders and says that at best you can be a community in India, but you cannot be a part of the Hindu nation. You can't be a part of the nation that is India. So he's the one who really sets Hindutva in its current frame and moves it forward. Politically, of course, as I said, initially the freedom struggle begins. First, there's of course a violent explosion like the 1857 rebellion, where there
Mm.
was an armed uprising against the British. It fails. Then we go to the other end of the spectrum where English educated, Western educated men exposed to democracy borrow these British ideas and engage in a moderate politics of petitions and lectures and talks and journalism that takes place. Tilak comes and upsets this, and Tilak makes it a mass movement, but it's still a mass movement in urban spaces. It's not really spread out to the hinterland. It's not spread out to the masses in terms of the villages, etc. That is where Gandhi comes in after Tilak. Gandhi's rise coincides with Tilak's death. In fact, when Tilak died, Gandhi went and carried Tilak's body to the funeral, to the cremation, and so on. So Gandhi, in many ways, sort of quite physically appointed himself Tilak's.
Took on the role as the
Yes,
new leader in a way. Yeah.
exactly. And he's the one who then takes it to the next stage of bringing in the peasant masses, the villagers, etc., by envisioning all of this in a different way. And remember, Gandhi was also something of a Hindu nationalist. He wasn't a communalist. He wasn't against Muslims or against other religions, but he also framed his nationalism in very Hindu terms, in very religious terms, etc. So there is a continuum, but there are also interesting distinctions between each of these figures. On the one hand, you find that each succeeds the other and makes the freedom struggle stronger in
Mm.
some ways, and ultimately they reach their goal. But each also has disagreements and differences from the guy who came before. So again, it's just a story of complexity and no simple answers.
No simple answers there. And I think that's one of the biggest contributions that you make through your book. But tell me, you started the discussion by setting out an objective, a goal about explaining the identity formation, the Hindu identity formation, which has captured the interest and imagination of a lot of people in the country and abroad. But now the book is out there in the market. It's done quite well. How do you see this book evolving? How do you think this book will change the way Indians and other people think about Indian identity, the confluence of Hindus and Christians and Muslims? What's your aspiration?
One thing that certainly played on my mind is we do live in the age of Hindu nationalism, but I also found it very unconvincing. Even if you don't like it, even if you don't believe and subscribe to Hindu nationalism or Hindutva, I found it a bit puzzling that to a lot of people, they almost seem to believe that Savarkar, this man who defines Hindutva in its final mold, woke up one fine morning and just wrote this definitive text on Hindutva, and somehow that became the fount of Hindu nationalism. That was always very simplistic. He sharpened something that was already there, but he gave it its sharpened end. Perhaps that is
Hmm,
a reasonable claim. So I was always very clear that I also want this book to be able to explain some of the triggers and dynamics that paved the way to this juncture that leads to the birth of Hindutva. So there's no point wringing your hands and complaining about Hindu nationalism. You also need to understand where it comes from, what are the historical triggers that lead to its emergence. Only then can you sort of even understand the phenomenon as a whole. And even for people who are anti Hindutva, this is my point, right? You can't even be anti something if you don't understand it to start with.
right.
Hoping that the book contributes to understanding the phenomenon better. I'm hoping that
Hmm,
in a time of Hindu nationalism, it does pose certain questions that gives people a sense of pause, because we also live in a time when people can be so convinced that they have the right answer. The missionaries who came in the 19th century with a fair bit of racism and negative views on India and Hinduism and so on did lasting damage simply because they were just so convinced that they had already got the right answers, that they were here
hmm,
to civilize these barbaric natives, etc. And people in colonized countries like yours and mine, we are living as we're still living with the consequences of that attitude that they showed, and we are
hmm.
also falling into that trap in the present with our ideological debates and this polarizing stuff that's happening in the world, etc. That kind of certainty to me is dangerous, and that's why I said that a good book for me is something that makes you pause and ask the right questions, and hopefully this book will serve that purpose.
Absolutely. Is there anything I should have asked you that I didn't, or any parting words that you'd like to share with our listeners who come from all around the world?
Well, I'm going to be a complete capitalist here and say that my only parting words are read my book. You can get it on Amazon India and Amazon UK, depending on where you are. And I hope you'll give it a shot. I think if you have any interest in nonfiction, history, understanding the present, especially when it comes to India, understanding religious interactions, if you're a scholar of religion, if you're interested in religion, this book is for you. But even if you're not, and even if you just have a general interest in history, you might find it appealing. So yeah, my parting words would be please go read the book.
And I'd add to that, do leave a comment. It makes it easier for other people to discover it. Even leave a comment after you hear the podcast or watch it on Network Capital TV. Manu, I love the way you've built your category of one, and I love the routine, the rigor, and the fact that you make Indians and people everywhere else think. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thanks again for having me.